I'm the Director General of the World Pensions Council. I'm also an advisory board member of the World Bank Global Infrastructure Facility, known as GIF. But I'm here in my personal, strictly in my personal capacity, so any stupid thing or mistake that I make in the coming minutes is only mine, and I'm expressing solely my personal view. Also, I was in New York at the UNGA and the Climate Week, and all this to say that I'm a little jet lagged because I didn't come from Paris as I had told Tracy, but actually I came from New York and only spent one day in Paris on the way to Cape Town. So I'm a little jet lagged, but there's strong coffee. So once again, mistakes shall be blamed upon sleep deprivation and the rest. I'm aware of time, so I just want to say that if there's one thing I want you to remember from what I'm going to say now, is really that ideas can change the world. And I'm not saying this at all from an idealistic way. I'm saying this from a very, very pragmatic perspective. And there's one man and one school in Chicago, so it's not the Chicago School of Sociology, but it's the Chicago School of Economics. And these people started, a bit like St. John the Baptist, preaching in the desert back in the 50s and early 60s. And back then, the consensus, the policy consensus, in America, in Britain, in France, back in the 40s, 50s, early 60s, was very much a center-left consensus. So if you were a CEO in Germany, in America, in Britain, in Scotland, back in the 50s and early 60s, you would care a little about the environment. It doesn't mean that you are a tree hugger or an eco-warrior, but the typical French or American CEO in the 50s was actually quite progressive. And the difference in salary between the average American CEO and the average American worker back then was a difference of 1 to 10 or 1 to 15. Today, it's a difference of 1 to 10,000. So the world changed a lot. And one of the reasons why this gap of salary widened crazily in the past 20, 30 years is because the ideas of Chicago triumphed. It took a lot of time. So these guys were preaching, these right-wing, let's use right-wing extreme capitalists were preaching in the desert back in the 40s and 50s, and they would meet in secret, or they would have small conclaves of academics in Switzerland, France, and Illinois and Michigan, and the room would be smaller than this and would be half empty. So really, they came from a very small group of right-wing academics, but eventually their ideas triumphed. And in essence, people like Reagan or Thatcher were really employees, or they were really, doing the bidding of these ideologues. They chose Reagan and Thatcher. They could have chosen anyone else, but their ideas triumphed. And the norm shifted to the right. And the intellectual norm became hostile to the environment and hostile to the working class. And so I'm going to finish that aparté, but that Chicago school is important because many of the CEOs, including the CEO that Tracy mentioned, these guys were trained by Milton Friedman, or they were trained by the disciples of Milton Friedman in Chicago, Harvard, etc. So their perspective wasn't really eco-friendly or progressive at all until very, very recently. And their words like bourgeois, bourgeois, nouveau riche, aristocrat are French words, of course. And Milton Friedman delivered a speech in the early 70s. So by the early 70s, he was starting to be famous. His ideas hadn't yet triumphed, but these right-wing ideas were on the rise in the 70s. And he was saying, when I hear a CEO, so I'm quoting, verbatim, when I hear a CEO speak about climate or the environment or nature or workers' rights, I'm reminded of that famous 17th century French play where there's a nouveau riche, there's a bourgeois nouveau riche who becomes a millionaire, and then he's aping the aristocrats and he wants to learn about poetry and philosophy and art, like many nouveau riche. And I'm reminded of that French bourgeois guy who discovers at the age of 70 that he had been speaking prose all his life because he didn't know the difference between poetry and prose. And so by saying this, Friedman was saying that he despised these CEOs who pretended to care about nature. And he said the only role of the CEO is to focus relentlessly, quarter after quarter, solely on maximizing net profits. Anything outside the realm of maximizing net profits on a quarterly basis is a distraction, and it's even, he was saying that it's either a distraction or it's the KGB or the communists trying to infiltrate America to destroy it from inside. So really, very right-wing. Today we're shocked, right? But in the early 70s, those ideas were spreading. And keep that in mind, because things are changing, but I think they're changing slowly. They have changed slowly. Perhaps we're entering perhaps now is a tipping point, and things will revert to the pre-neoliberal, pre-Milton Friedman consensus, hopefully. So now I'm starting my real presentation. So you see the paradox we live in today. Because on the one hand, there is a rise in idealism. So on the one hand, more and more people speak about the environment, ecology, green tech, green investment. But at the same time, there is a rise in geopolitical cynicism, which is different from the Milton Friedman ideas. That school of thought is not neoliberal like Chicago. It is geoeconomics. So it's another form of right-wing culture. And so they believe in pure power, state power. And so the men wearing the helmets are ruling the world, in essence, on a certain plane. And they believe in really old-fashioned infrastructure, oil and gas, really oil and gas, huge infrastructure projects, to hell with the environment. And they are really controlling, in a way, the two superpowers, and they are setting the agenda. So this is a geoeconomic agenda. But at the same time, in parallel, even in China and America, you have a rise in ESG, sustainable development, sustainable. So these two ideas are rising in parallel. And I've put a picture of a book that was published in French in the mid-80s by Edem Kojo, who was the chairman of the African Union, which I think back then was called the Organization for African Unity. And sadly, when Edem Kojo was president of the African Union, most African states were dictatorships, and they were either communist or right-wing dictatorships. And so when a man like Edem Kojo published Et demain l'Afrique in the mid-80s, his ideas about the environment and social progress were really in the minority because, of course, it was the Cold War, and Africa was a playground for the Soviet Union and America, so no one cared about that. But fast forward today, many of the ideas in that great book are actually very relevant today. So I think there's a problem here in some of my slides. So quickly, I'm going to give you my 2-cent perspective on why I think South Africa is lagging behind its potential when it comes to ESG and green finance. But after all, this city was founded by Dutch followers of a French intellectual, an academic, called Jean Calvin, in English, John Calvin. And so these guys came from really a very right-wing, northeastern Dutch milieu, influenced by the French Calvinist ideas of Jean Calvin. And so to them, nature was to be dominated. Nature was like a beast, a savage beast, and it was to be tamed and dominated, but there was no real respect for nature in the writings of Jean Calvin and his Dutch colonist followers. Ironically, the ANC was and still is perhaps very Marxist, and in the writings of Karl Marx or Fidel Castro, there's not a lot of respect for nature either, sadly. So you have the same, Karl Marx was not a Dutch Calvinist, but he shared that perspective with the right-wing Dutch Calvinist about, productivism. So really, what was important for the ANC or the Marxist was to increase output, not net profit, like Friedman, but increase output. And if you want to increase output, to hell with nature, right? So in both schools of thought, the right wing and the left wing, there is a consensus against the environment in a way, because one of them wants to maximize quarterly net profit, the other one wants to maximize annual output, but in both instances, pollution is viewed as an externality. So the cost of pollution is not important. So I'm sorry because some of my slides were not. So what I want to say here is some of my slides disappeared because different version of PowerPoint. But what I want to say is basically that ideology of Thatcher and Friedman became triumphant from the year 1990 until now. So you could say that they had 34, 33 years of intellectual triumph, and things are changing. But to make a long story short, they transformed the world economy in the past 35 years, and they made it very short-termist. So of course, financial short-termism is the enemy of the environment. Finance is not. So finance is not the enemy of the environment. Capitalism is not the enemy of the environment. However, short-termism is. And the problem is these people, Nicolas J, Don Reagan, who were the brain trust of the Reagan White House, they came from Wall Street, and they came from Harvard Law School or the Chicago School, and when they reached the White House in the year 1981, being former stockbrokers, Don Reagan was a former Merrill Lynch stockbroker, Nicolas J was a former Morgan Stanley stockbroker. Their goal was to turn the whole world into basically a financial market. And to a large extent, Don Reagan and Nick Brady succeeded. And what we call today emerging market bonds was their invention. So until the early 80s, the debt, the fixed income debt held by countries like South Africa, Indonesia, Malaysia was sitting on the book of governments and banks in New York, Paris, London. And what Nick Brady and Don Reagan said, hey, wait a minute, that's dead money. Let's slice the debt and turn it into fixed income emerging market bonds. So they invented literally the emerging market bond asset class. And so the whole world became, of course, much more short-termist, and there was a financialization of the world across all asset classes. And it's the complete opposite from long-termism. So if you're a long-term investor, you are committed to your investment, and you put money over 5, 6, 10, 15 years. So it's a completely different mindset. And so that guy here on the left-hand side is one of the symbols of long-term investment. He's a French-American academic, and his name is General Georges Doriot. And he may not be a very famous character, but he's the founder of what we call the Silicon Valley. And he is the inventor of what we call today venture capitalism. And so that guy also transformed the world economy, but his perspective was very different from that of the Chicago School. His perspective was long-term, private equity. So if you put money in a company, a non-listed company, you should completely ignore weekly, monthly, quarterly fluctuations. You should be an investor for the long haul. And I think the ideas of Georges Doriot are more compatible with an ESG-oriented, SDG-informed kind of capitalism. And on the right-hand side, you have that other perspective by a great Romanian Anglo-American academic called Ed Ludwak, who teaches at Georgetown, and he coined the term geoeconomics. So his worldview is very realistic, and so you could say that the ideas of Ed Ludwak about turbo-capitalism and geoeconomics, they are ideas that are very popular today in the Trump White House. And they're also very popular today within the Chinese government. So they believe in raw power, and to them, those who believe in turbo capitalism and geoeconomics, it's not really about long-term investment, ESG, etc. It's about using economy to generate power, raw power. And so these two ideas are kind of competing, if you will, in the world today. So these pictures here, symbolize the geoeconomic school of thought, which these guys, of course, don't care a lot about the environment. And here you have President Trump wearing a helmet, and there's a wordplay behind him, and the wordplay, I don't know if you can see it, but it's America digs coal, and he's surrounded by basically plutocrats, and in many ways his ideas are shared by the guy smiling in the middle, who are the Chinese, Politburo leadership. They believe in the same ideas as Trump, in essence, and in many ways they're more powerful than Trump, because basically you have the symbol of Twitter, because companies like Amazon or Google, they own most of the media in America, including the so-called liberal media. And if someone at the New York Times or the Washington Post dares writing a small critique of the Chinese leader, you can be sure that the CEO of the mother company will receive a phone call from Beijing, and the next minute the article will be removed. Trump cannot do that. Trump, he every day has to swallow insults from CNN and the New York Times and the Washington Post, who pompously pretend to be progressive and liberal, but at the same time, they're not, because of course, when they receive an order from Beijing, they will really remove the article. So really, in a way, you have really raw power. So really, this is the geoeconomic school of thought. They don't, to make a long story short, they don't care about the environment or green finance. Now here you have basically how things can change. And things can change if asset owners flex their fiduciary muscles. And that's very, very important. So the old man with the cane, he's the symbol of pension funds. And these pension funds, they own trillions of dollars in assets, including listed equity, stocks, private equity, bonds, and they either invest directly, so they can buy shares in companies and bonds directly, this is the bottom arrow, and they can invest indirectly, this is the upper arrows, and when they invest indirectly, they would give an investment mandate, for example, to a South African bank or to a South African asset management company, and they would tell that South African fund management company, okay, I'm giving you $500 million, or I'm giving you $1 billion, I want it to be invested in African bonds or African equity with an ESG twist. I want it to be invested in renewable energy in Africa. I want it to be invested in blah, blah, blah. And so this is the upper arrow. And by flexing their muscle, the board members of the pension funds, the trustees, they can change the world. Sadly, until recently, pension trustees were dormant giants. So they were really sleeping at the wheel, and they didn't really flex their muscles. So they would get invited by the investment bank and the asset management company to play golf every 6 months, and they wouldn't spend much time analyzing in depth what was going on. Thank Zeus, it's changing. So this mighty giant, which had a pent-up power but wasn't using it, is waking up. And you guys are blessed to be in a country where you have common law. It's one of the good aspects of English or British colonialism, because in common law you have basically trusteeship. And the notion of trusteeship is crucial. It wasn't really used, it was dormant, but as board members become more engaged, as board members become more active, and I want to praise the work that Tracy's doing here, because basically by spreading the good word, civil society and board members and trustees, they can put more pressure. Progressively, that pent-up power that they have, which wasn't really used, can be used. So here, basically, there was a problem in the transfer of the slides. So to make a long story short, I don't know if you can see this, but here is the annualized economic growth for the past 6-7 years. So this is the x-axis. And on the y-axis, you have decorrelation from the EU core. So what does it mean, decorrelation from the core? It's basically that it's the financial, economic, legal, cultural distance from Germany, right? So you can see that all the countries here, like Denmark, Holland, France, are correlated to Germany, right? The size of the flag symbolizes the total size of assets owned collectively by pension funds in each and every country. And we had to cut down the size of the British, Canadian, and American flag, because had we, especially the American, so the American flag, we really had to cut down, because in reality it should have been much bigger. But to make a long story short, flag size equals pension industry, or total AUM of the pensions in the country. Here is annualized growth, and in the middle is the correlation with the core EU countries, Germany and France. So as you can see, Holland is a pension superpower. However, the economic growth in Holland hasn't been great in the past 4 or 5 years because it was dragged down by the decline of the German economy. Many African emerging markets, many of your neighbors here, they would be near Australia and the US in terms of economic growth. So really, they're growing very fast. Sadly, South Africa is not growing fast. So there is a problem here. There's a macroeconomic problem in the country, because economic growth here has been mediocre, which for a country like this one is a shame, really, because, like I said, many of your neighbors on the continent, they've been growing faster. However, there's one good thing about South Africa, is the size of its pension industry and the size of its financial sector, which is quite big. So if you look at the size of the South African flag, it's practically as big, it's slightly bigger than the Swedish flag. So it's really not bad, because it's bigger than the French flag, and it's bigger than so it's really, the size of the pension assets owned collectively here by future retirees and employees is really big by international standards. So that's very good, and that can be put to use in the future. Also, 40% of the capital of companies listed on the Johannesburg Exchange are actually owned by local South African pension funds. That's also a strength. It's a fabulous strength upon which you guys can build on, because in many countries, local domestic pension funds, they barely own 5 or 10 or 12% of the companies listed on the exchange. So really, with all its faults, South Africa has two great things going for it. I think collectively, the total size of the pension assets here is like 350 or 400 billion. So it's really good money. And one of the reasons why it's great is that if you are a big American or Canadian or Australian, remember these countries have trillions, if you look at Canada, Britain, trillions of dollars in assets, and they have decided to increase their exposure to emerging markets. They have decided to increase their allocation to Africa. So there is money coming in the coming quarters and the coming years to South Africa to be invested in investment mandates focusing on ESG, SDG-driven assets. And so when they will come, and they are starting to come here, the big ones, so the big Canadian, Australian pension funds, they not only like to give mandates to local asset management companies and banks, but they also at the same time, in parallel, like to co-invest directly with anchor investors. And so typically the anchor investors, they are those large South African pension funds, insurance companies, endowments. And so that's also a plus. The fact that you guys have a homegrown pension industry is something that is really great, because it will allow you to attract more money from Amsterdam, Montreal, Toronto, etc. Now, I think I mentioned before, that contrast between, the rise in idealism and the geoeconomic, school of thought. No need to say more about it. But one question we could ask, is it good for Africa? So is that Sino-American? Is the rivalry between Beijing and Washington something good? Many experts will say, oh, it's bad. So I was reading the financial press yesterday, and I was so many articles saying, oh, it's really bad. The recession here is partly because there is Brexit and there is a trade war between the US and China, so it has negative impact, blah, blah, blah. I think it can also have a very positive impact, because if there is a rivalry between Beijing and Washington, it means that they will come to pivot nation. And South Africa, for geographic and geopolitical reasons, is a pivot nation. And so these nations will attract money from both China and Washington, D.C. And we are starting to see it with the New Silk Road, because for the Chinese leadership, the New Silk Road stretches from Beijing not only to Istanbul, but it stretches from Beijing to Johannesburg and Cape Town and Dublin. And so the Americans ignored that New Silk Road, and now they're waking up and they're having to counter the Chinese New Silk Road strategy. And so they're putting more money on the table. So for countries like Angola or Mozambique or here, it could be great, because the rivalry between the Americans and the Chinese could mean that you could have more leverage, basically. Now, I've put here life on land, gender equality, and decent work and economic growth. Why have I chosen these 3 icons among 17 SDGs? Because one message I want to pass to you is that it would be a mistake, I think, to focus only on low carbon in itself. So if you focus solely on low carbon, only on the environment, only on climate change, as much as it's very good to be focused in life, I think it's a mistake. Why? Because you run the risk of alienating the working class. And it's exactly what happened in France. So in France, some of the thought leaders and activists focused a lot solely on climate change and low carbon. And in the end, they have really antagonized the working class. And there's a backlash from corners of the working class against the environment, which is really a shame. So I think it has to be in parallel. I think those people advocating life on land and climate action should at the same time advocate gender equality and decent work, decent wages, and economic growth at the same time, because doing one at the expense of the other will be very detrimental to your cause. And after all, we can learn from Chicago and Milton Friedman, because basically what they did is they did advocate for the complete opposite of these 3 icons at the same time. So we can learn from, it's very smart. What they did, they built a coalition. So to seize power, Thatcher and Reagan had to build a broad coalition, and I think we have to do the same. We have really to make the progressive agenda for the working class and tell the workers, including these coal workers who voted for Trump, we are not your enemies. We are not the enemies of blue-collar worker. In the long term, in the long run, what we are doing is in your interest. I'm aware of time, so I'm gonna accelerate the pace. I'm gonna close out. Okay. So basically, why is now the South African government trying to say that they want to put their hands on pension assets and tell pension trustees where they ought to invest? Because the national debt more than doubled in the past 9 years here. So of course, the president says, okay, well, it's great. We have 400 billion in pension money. Why not use that pension money to buy government bonds or to fund, railroads or highways, etc.? And of course, there is a backlash from the part of pension trustees, and they're absolutely right. Investment decisions should be made solely by pension trustees. Many of them are representatives of the working class. These guys are elected or nominated by employees, and they know what's best. It's not for the government to tell them where to invest. And I'm going to wrap up the talk by saying, that there is some very positive news flow. So really, if you look at literally the past few weeks, very positive news. One of them was a group of US corporate leaders back in August. They called the Business Roundtable, a very right-wing Chicago school club. And they met in New York 7 weeks ago, and they had an epiphany. So you had the CEOs of all the big Wall Street giants said, oh my God, it's fantastic, climate, the environment. So on a certain plane, you can be cynical and say, oh, they're lying, blah, blah, blah. So that's why I put that article, which I really like, because the guy says that it brings gushing, grumbling, and grousing. So we should take it with a grain of salt, but at the same time, they felt obliged to pay lip service to the church of SDG. So it must be that they felt that the pressure was mounting rapidly. So that's a positive sign. And really, there are companies in Australia, in Canada, in Britain, that are earning 20-30% of net profits per year by investing in solar and renewable. So it doesn't have to be an impact 2-3% project. Companies are making today billions of dollars of net profit by focusing on ESG and the environment. So that's a Spanish company called Iberdrola, and one of the most profitable companies in the world, and they make their money by building and managing offshore wind projects in and around England. And it's really sad because we are here in the Two Oceans aquarium. South Africa has an amazing topography. So South Africa has actually more oceans and more wind conditions than England and Holland. South Africa has more potential solar energy than Egypt and Morocco put together. So it's really, and these countries, Morocco and Egypt are less developed, less rich than South Africa, but they produce more solar energy. So really, I think if you guys put more pressure on the government, but also civil society gets its act together, there's no reason why South Africa shouldn't be in the coming years a leader in wind and solar. So I'm going to finish on that positive note.